They told me I was nothing, that I came from nothing and would amount to nothing. And on the morning of March 14th, 1938, when Mrs. Hargrove read aloud the letter from a lawyer in Beckley, West Virginia, informing me that my dead mother's aunt, a woman I had never met, had left me a sealed limestone cave and surrounding 12 acres of hollow land, every girl in the dormitory laughed. Even the youngest ones, even the ones who usually cried themselves to sleep. They laughed because it was easier to laugh at me than to think about their own futures. And Mrs. Hargrove, with her steel gray bun and her permanent expression of mild disgust, folded the letter, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Elara Voss, I suppose even the dead can play cruel jokes on the living." I was 16 years old. I had been at the Briarfield Home for Unwanted Girls since I was 9, when tuberculosis took my mother and my father simply vanished, walked out the back door of our rented house in Charleston one Tuesday afternoon, and never came back. 7 years I had lived among girls who were taught to sew, to clean, to keep their eyes down, and to be grateful for the cold oatmeal and the colder beds. 7 years I had stolen every book I could get my hands on, science textbooks from the donation bins, old agricultural pamphlets from the church basement, a water-stained copy of the Practical Gardener's Almanac that I hid under my mattress like contraband. Mrs. Hargrove hated my reading. She called it vanity. She said girls who read too much got ideas, and ideas in a girl like me were as dangerous as matches in a hayloft. She wasn't entirely wrong about the danger, I suppose, because the moment I heard the words sealed limestone cave, something lit up inside me. Not a match, but a furnace, and I decided right then, standing in that drafty dormitory with 19 girls laughing at my inheritance, that I would leave Briarfield and I would never come back. If you want to find out what I did with that sealed cave in the mountains of West Virginia, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a suitcase of stolen books turned a hole in the ground into something that changed an entire valley, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I built in that darkness, what I grew where nothing was supposed to grow, is a story that still lives in those mountains today. I left 3 days later. Mrs. Hargrove didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved. I was the girl who asked questions nobody wanted to answer. Why didn't we learn mathematics past the 6th grade level? Why weren't we allowed to apply to the teachers' college in town? Why did the boys at the Briarfield Boys' Home get workshop training while we got sewing needles and silence? I was inconvenient. And now I was someone else's problem. Except there was no one else. Just me and a letter and a cave I'd never seen. The lawyer, Mr. Aldridge, was a thin man with kind eyes who met me at the bus station in Beckley. He drove me 30 miles into the mountains in a truck that rattled like it was dying. The road turned to dirt, then to mud, then to something that barely qualified as a path. We climbed through forests so thick the sunlight came through in coins, past abandoned coal camps and hollowed-out hillsides, until we reached a valley that opened up like a secret someone had kept for 1,000 years. Your great-aunt Marin lived here alone for 40 years, Mr. Aldridge told me, parking the truck beside a collapsed fence. She was particular. People in town thought she was strange. She studied things, plants, minerals, underground water systems. She wrote letters to universities that mostly went unanswered. When she died, nobody came to the funeral except me. He handed me a rusted key and pointed to the hillside. There, half hidden by rhododendron and wild grape, was a wooden door set into the rock face, framed by hand-cut limestone blocks. The cave goes back about 200 feet, he said. Maren sealed the entrance after she finished her work inside. I don't know what you'll find. She left instructions that only family could open it. He paused. She also left this. He reached behind the truck seat and pulled out a leather-bound journal, thick as a Bible, held together with a strap. On the cover, in careful handwriting, it said, Notes on the Cultivation of Life in Darkness, Maren Voss, 1901 to 1937. I stood there holding that journal like it was a living thing, like it had a heartbeat. And I suppose it did, in a way. It held 40 years of one woman's obsession. The idea that you could grow food underground, using the stable temperature of a cave, the moisture of limestone, and a system of reflected light that she had spent decades perfecting. The first week nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. I had arrived in late March, and the mountains of West Virginia don't care what the calendar says. Winter holds on with both hands up there. The cabin Maren had built beside the cave entrance was still standing, but barely. The roof leaked in 4 places. The wood stove was cracked. Mice had made nests in the mattress. The windows were so filthy that the light coming through them was the color of old tea. There was no food except some ancient jars of preserved beans in the root cellar, and half of those had gone bad, the lids swollen and hissing when I touched them. The second night, it snowed. Not a gentle dusting, but a real mountain snow, heavy and wet, the kind that bends trees and buries roads. I woke at 3 a.m. to water dripping on my face through the roof and the wood stove dead because the firewood I'd gathered was green and wouldn't hold a flame. I lay there in the dark, shaking so hard my teeth ached, and I thought, this is how I die. Not from cruelty, not from injustice, but from cold and silence and the absolute indifference of the mountains to one small girl's survival. I thought about going back. I thought about Mrs. Hargrove's oatmeal and the dormitory's thin warmth and the certainty of a life I understood, even if I hated it. I thought about the girls laughing and how warm their laughter had been compared to this cold. But then, as the gray dawn finally crept into the cabin, I dragged myself to the table and opened Maren's journal by candlelight and read the first entry. They will tell you that nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. The dark is where all seeds begin. In the morning, I opened the cave. The key fit the padlock, which was rusted but functional. The wooden door swung inward with a groan that echoed into blackness. I lit a kerosene lantern and stepped inside, and what I saw made me drop to my knees. Maren had built an underground garden, not a garden in the way you might picture, with rows of vegetables and cheerful sunlight. This was something stranger and more beautiful. The cave's main chamber was roughly 60 feet wide and maybe 15 feet high at its peak, with a natural limestone floor that Maren had leveled and divided into raised beds made of stacked stone. Along the ceiling, she had installed a series of angled mirrors, actual glass mirrors, some cracked, some clouded, all mounted on wooden frames, that caught the light from a narrow natural chimney near the entrance and bounced it deeper into the cave. During the hours when the sun hit that chimney at the right angle, the cave glowed with a soft, diffused light that reached all the way to the back wall. But that wasn't all. Maren had understood something about caves that most people never consider. The temperature underground stays nearly constant year-round. In that part of West Virginia, the cave held steady around 55 degrees, too cool for summer crops, but warm enough that nothing ever froze. She had built a series of stone channels that directed the cave's natural water seepage into a collection pool and then through the raised beds. The limestone itself, she'd discovered, slowly released calcium and other minerals into the water, creating a natural fertilizer. The beds were empty now, of course. Whatever Maren had last grown had died or been harvested years ago. But the infrastructure was there. The mirrors, the water channels, the stone beds, the careful engineering of a woman who had spent 4 decades turning a geological curiosity into a farm. I sat on the cave floor and cried. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming recognition that someone like me, someone the world had called strange, someone who studied and questioned and refused to accept the way things were, had come before me, had lived in this very place, had built something extraordinary out of nothing but knowledge and stubbornness and time. The first season was a desperate improvisation. Maren's journal was detailed, but it assumed a reader who already had supplies, seeds, tools. I had almost nothing. I walked 7 miles to the nearest town, Sable Creek, population maybe 300, and spent the small amount of money Mr. Aldridge had given me from Maren's estate on the barest essentials: seeds, a hand axe, nails, flour, salt. The people in town looked at me the way people always looked at me. The girl from the orphanage, the strange one, the one who asked too many questions, a woman at the general store, Mrs. Pruitt, asked me where I was staying. When I told her, her face went white. "That's the Voss place," she said. "Up in Blind Hollow. That woman was a witch." "She was a scientist," I said. Mrs. Pruitt gave me my change without another word. I followed Maren's journal like a scripture. I repaired the mirror system first, replacing 2 shattered mirrors with polished tin sheets I made from cans. Not as effective, but they caught some light. I cleaned the water channels. I tested the soil in the raised beds and found it remarkably rich, dark, and alive with the microorganisms that Maren had cultivated over decades. I planted cold-tolerant crops first: lettuce, spinach, kale, turnips, radishes, things that could handle 55 degrees and partial light. And then I waited, and I nearly starved while I waited. The forest saved me that first spring. I ate ramps and dandelion greens and fiddlehead ferns. I found a patch of wild strawberries in a clearing and ate them so fast I was sick. I caught crawdads in the creek and cooked them over the wood stove. I lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose. There were mornings I woke up so dizzy I had to crawl to the water bucket. But the cave kept its promise. 6 weeks after planting, I harvested my first lettuce. It was pale, lighter green than sun-grown lettuce, but it was crisp and sweet and alive. I stood in that dim cave holding a head of lettuce I had grown underground, and I felt something I had never felt in my entire 16 years of life. I felt powerful. That summer, I expanded. Maren's journal described a technique she called thermal banking, using the cave's back wall, which was solid limestone, as a heat sink. During the warmest months, the rock absorbed heat from the air that drifted in through the entrance. In winter, it slowly released that warmth, keeping the cave's temperature from dropping below 50 degrees, even when it was 0 outside. She had maximized this by building a second chamber deeper in the cave, connected to the first by a narrow passage where she grew mushrooms and root vegetables that needed no light at all. I followed her instructions and opened the passage to the second chamber. It was smaller, maybe 20 feet across, but perfect. I started mushroom logs using fallen oak from the hollow. I planted potatoes and parsnips in the dark chamber. And in the main chamber, my mirror system was working well enough that I could grow not just greens, but herbs, basil, thyme, oregano, that filled the cave with a scent so beautiful it made me forget I was underground. The first person to find me was old Ezekiel Thorne. Ezekiel was 73 years old, a retired coal miner who lived alone in a cabin about 2 miles up the ridge. He'd known Marin. He told me he was the only person in the valley who hadn't thought she was crazy. "She showed me once," he said, standing at the cave entrance, refusing to come in at first. "Must have been 1920. She had tomatoes growing in there. In January. I thought I was dreaming." He came in. He looked at my beds, my repaired mirrors, my water channels. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he looked at me with eyes that had seen 50 years of darkness underground in the coal mines, and he said, "You're her. You're just like her." Ezekiel became my teacher in the ways Marin's journal couldn't be. He taught me how to split wood efficiently, how to repair the cabin roof, how to read weather in the clouds, and the behavior of birds. He brought me tools from his shed, a proper shovel, a hand plow, a set of chisels for working limestone. In return, I fed him fresh greens and mushrooms and herbs from the cave. He said it was the best food he'd eaten in 30 years. "The mines took everything from me," he told me one evening, sitting on the cabin porch while fireflies lit up the hollow. "My lungs, my wife. She left when the coughing got too bad. My son moved to Detroit and don't write. But this," he gestured at the cave entrance, "this is a mine that gives instead of takes." Over the next 2 years, word spread, slowly at first. A hunter who wandered through the hollow and couldn't believe the smell of fresh basil in November. A family from Sable Creek whose children were sick with scurvy. I gave them bags of greens and asked nothing in return. A school teacher named Ruth Calloway who came to investigate the rumors and stayed for 3 hours, asking questions about Marin's mirror system and the thermal properties of limestone. Ruth was the first person besides Ezekiel who looked at me and saw not a strange girl, but a capable one. She was 32, unmarried, the daughter of a mining engineer who had taught her to think mechanically. She helped me redesign the mirror array using proper glass and calculated angles based on the sun's seasonal arc. With her improvements, the main chamber got nearly 4 hours of usable light per day in summer and 2 hours in winter. It was enough. The cave thrived. By 1941, I was growing more food than I could eat. The cave produced year-round. That was its miracle. While every other farm in the valley lay dormant under snow from November to March, my underground garden kept producing. Lettuce, kale, spinach, chard, turnips, radishes, mushrooms, herbs, potatoes, carrots, parsnips. The variety alone was staggering for a mountain community that survived winter on canned goods and salt pork. I began trading in Sable Creek. At first, people were suspicious. Winter greens seemed unnatural, possibly dangerous. Mrs. Pruitt from the general store told people I was practicing some kind of dark art, growing things where no sun reached. A preacher named Reverend Oakes even warned his congregation about unnatural harvests. But hunger is a more powerful preacher than any man in a pulpit, and the Depression had left scars in those mountains that ran deeper than the coal seams. One by one, families tried my food. They tasted the lettuce and the spinach and the crisp little radishes that snapped between their teeth, and they came back for more. Children who hadn't eaten fresh greens since October were eating salads in January. Their mothers looked at me differently after that. I set up a small stand at the edge of town every Saturday morning, beside the bridge over Sable Creek. I arranged everything in baskets lined with clean cloth. Marin's journal had taught me that presentation matters, that people eat first with their eyes. I never set foot in town proper. I didn't need to. They came to me. The war changed everything. When the young men left for Europe and the Pacific, The women and old men who remained struggled to feed themselves. The government was buying every scrap of food for the troops. Rationing turned pantries into carefully guarded vaults. Prices soared. Gardens withered in the summer drought of 1943, and the autumn harvest was the worst anyone could remember. And my cave kept producing. 55 degrees, year-round, indifferent to drought and frost and the desperate politics of wartime. The limestone wept its steady moisture. The mirrors caught their daily ration of light. The mushrooms grew in the dark chamber as they always had, patient and quiet and unstoppable. I didn't raise my prices. I lowered them. When families couldn't pay, I gave food away. I loaded baskets with greens and mushrooms and potatoes and carried them to doorsteps where pride would have kept people from asking. Ezekiel, whose cough had grown terrible by then, the black lung finally claiming what the mines had started decades ago, watched me load baskets for families who had once called Marin a witch and called me her strange little heir. He shook his head and smiled. "You're feeding the same people who would have let you starve," he said. "I know," I said. "That's why it matters." Ezekiel died in the winter of 1944. Quietly, in his chair by the fire, with a bowl of my mushroom soup still warm on the table beside him. He had left me a letter. In it, he said I was the closest thing to family he'd had in 20 years, and he left me his cabin, his tools, and his 30 acres of ridgeland that connected to my hollow. I buried him on the ridge, under an oak tree where you could see 3 valleys. I planted rosemary on his grave because Marin's journal said rosemary was for remembrance, and I wanted the mountain to remember him. With Ezekiel's land, I expanded above ground. I built terraces on the south-facing slope, stone walls filled with soil carried up from the creek bottom, and planted apple trees, berry bushes, and summer crops that needed full sun. The cave remained my winter engine, my secret weapon, but now I had a complete system. Summer gardens on the terraces, year-round production underground. Ruth Calloway helped me write a pamphlet, Cave Farming, a practical guide to year-round underground cultivation, that we mimeographed at the schoolhouse and mailed to agricultural extension offices across Appalachia. Most ignored it. A few wrote back, curious. 2 professors from West Virginia University drove out to see the cave in person and left shaking their heads, not in disbelief, but in wonder. "This is remarkable," one of them said. "This is genuinely remarkable. Why doesn't anyone know about this?" "Because it was built by a woman no one listened to," I told him, "and inherited by a girl no one wanted." In the spring of 1946, a car I didn't recognize came up the hollow road. I was on the terrace, pruning apple trees that were just beginning to blossom, when a woman stepped out. She was older, mid-60s, dressed in city clothes that were entirely wrong for the mud. She stood there looking at the terraces, the cabin, the cave entrance with its wooden door standing open, and she put her hand over her mouth. It was Mrs. Hargrove. She had aged badly. The steel in her had gone to rust. She stood in my hollow and she looked at everything I had built and she cried. I had never seen her cry. I didn't think she could. "I came to apologize," she said. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. Everything about her was smaller. "I read about you in the university bulletin, about the cave farm, about what you're doing here, and I realized—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I realized I spent 20 years telling girls they couldn't be anything, and you proved me wrong." I invited her inside. I made her tea from my own dried mint and gave her bread I had baked that morning. She sat at my table and looked around at the books on every shelf, the jars of seeds labeled in my careful handwriting, the maps of the cave system I had drawn and pinned to the wall, and she said something I will never forget. "Maren Voss, your aunt, she wrote to me once. Did you know that? Years ago, before you came to Briarfield. She wrote to ask if there were any girls in our care who loved science, who loved growing things. She wanted to mentor someone, to pass on her knowledge." Mrs. Hargrove's hands shook around the teacup. I threw the letter away. I thought she was a foolish old woman. I thought girls didn't need science. I thought I was protecting you all by teaching you to be practical. I sat with that for a long time. The idea that Maren had reached out, that she had tried to find me, or someone like me, before she died. That Mrs. Hargrove's cruelty hadn't just been cruel to me, but had cut the thread between me and the one person who could have loved me and taught me from the beginning. But I had found Maren anyway, through the cave, through the journal, through the work itself. I had found her in every carefully drawn diagram, every observation about limestone and light, every sentence that proved a woman alone in a hollow could understand the world as deeply as any university professor. "I forgive you," I said to Mrs. Hargrove, and I meant it. Not because she deserved it, but because I did. Because carrying anger is like carrying stones uphill. It exhausts you, and you never reach the top. I sent her home with a basket of food. I married in 1948. His name was Thomas Wilder, a returning soldier who had lost his left hand in France and found that the only place his missing hand didn't matter was in a garden. He came to the hollow looking for work. Someone in Sable Creek had told him about the crazy woman growing vegetables inside a mountain, and he stayed because he understood, without me having to explain, why growing things in the dark wasn't strange. It was revolutionary. He looked at the cave the way I had looked at it the first time, not with disbelief, but with recognition. Like he'd been waiting his whole life to find a place where broken things were still useful. We married on the ridge above Ezekiel's grave in September, when the mountains were on fire with color, and the apple trees on the terraces were heavy with their first real crop. Ruth Calloway stood as my witness. Thomas's brother came from Ohio. It was a small wedding, but it was ours, and that was enough. We had 3 children. We expanded the cave system, opening a 3rd chamber that Thomas helped me engineer with proper ventilation and an improved mirror array that used automobile headlight reflectors, a trick he'd learned from a field mechanic in the Army. The 3rd chamber was our masterpiece, warm enough for tomatoes in winter, bright enough for peppers, productive enough to feed not just our family, but dozens of others. We trained apprentices, young people from the haulers and coal camps who had nowhere else to go, the same kind of unwanted, overlooked, difficult children I had been. Children who asked too many questions. Children who read when they should have been working. Children who looked at the world and saw not what it was, but what it could be. By the 1960s, the Blind Hollow Agricultural Center, as Ruth Calloway had officially named it, was training 30 students a year in sustainable farming techniques. The cave farm was producing enough food to supply 3 valley communities through the winter months. My pamphlet had been expanded into a proper book, published by the State University Press and translated into 4 languages. People came from as far as Norway and Japan to see the cave. They walked through the chambers with their mouths open, watching lettuce grow in reflected light, touching the warm limestone walls, tasting mushrooms that had never seen the sun. And I told every single one of them the same thing. This isn't my work. This is Maren Voss's work. I just carried it forward. Thomas died in 1971 on a warm September evening, sitting on the porch where Ezekiel used to sit, watching the last light pour like honey down the hollow walls. My children were grown by then. One a teacher in Beckley, one an agricultural engineer at the State University, one a doctor in Charleston who came home every Christmas and every planting season. They carried the hollow in their bones. They carried Maren's curiosity and Thomas's gentleness and my stubbornness, and they went out into the world and did things I could never have imagined when I was a 16-year-old girl holding a rusted key and a dead woman's journal. I kept working. I kept growing. My hands knew the cave the way a pianist knows a keyboard. Every stone, every channel, every angle of light was muscle memory. The cave never stopped producing, and neither did I. In 1975, the state of West Virginia designated Blind Hollow as a historic agricultural site. In 1978, the Appalachian Regional Commission awarded our program a grant that allowed us to build a proper learning center with dormitories for students. In 1979, a documentary crew came and filmed me at 67, climbing down into the cave to tend beds I had planted 40 years earlier. They filmed me kneeling in the soil, my hands dark with limestone earth, my hair white as the mushrooms growing in the back chamber. "Doesn't it bother you?" the interviewer asked. "Working underground? In the dark?" "Honey," I said, "I spent the first 16 years of my life in the dark. An orphanage is darker than any cave. At least in a cave, things grow." I died on a Tuesday morning in October of 1982, at the age of 70. Quietly, the way Ezekiel had gone, sitting in a chair, a cup of mint tea beside me, the autumn light coming through the window and painting the cabin walls gold. My children said I looked peaceful. My youngest, Maren, yes, I named her Maren, said I looked like someone who had finished a very long and very good book and was satisfied with the ending. The Blind Hollow Agricultural Center continued after me. My children and their children tended the cave and the terraces in the apprenticeship program. The last time anyone counted, more than 600 students had passed through the program, learning to grow food in impossible places, in caves, on mountainsides, in abandoned mines, in the margins and crevices where the world said nothing could live. Maren Voss's journal sits in a glass case at the entrance to the cave now. Visitors can read the first page, the one I read by candlelight on that freezing March night in 1938. They will tell you that nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. The dark is where all seeds begin. So let me ask you something. What cave have you been standing outside of? What sealed door have you been too afraid, too tired, too beaten down to open? What did someone tell you about yourself that you believed? That you were nothing? That you came from nothing? That you'd amount to nothing? And what would happen if you decided today, right now, that they were wrong? Because here's what I learned in 40 years of growing food underground. The conditions don't have to be perfect. They almost never are. The light doesn't have to be bright. It just has to reach far enough. The soil doesn't have to be rich. It just has to be alive. And you don't have to be ready. You just have to begin. Every extraordinary thing I built started with a single head of pale lettuce in a dark cave. Every community I fed started with one basket given to a family that never thanked me. Every student I taught started with one question I wasn't afraid to ask. The dark is where all seeds begin. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own sealed caves and rusted keys, Hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives out of the nothing they were given. And remember, the people who told you nothing could grow in the dark were the ones who never bothered to plant anything. Your cave is waiting. Open the door.